Well,
Okay,
it is 12 noon, so
yeah,
um,
it's 12 noon, and so why don't we get started? I want to welcome everyone to our presentation on delegated credentialing for managed care plans. My name is Matt Thompson. I'm the Executive Vice President of Equalize RCM. We are a provider of revenue cycle services for over 3,000 physicians from coast to coast. And we have um, our headquarters in Austin, Texas, and we also have offices in Atlanta, Washington, D.C., Durham, North Carolina, and Oklahoma City, amongst a few others. I'm excited about this presentation. It seems to have resonated with a lot of people. Very pertinent topic. Uh, in a minute, I'll introduce our speaker, and we will give a presentation on delegated credentialing. And you can ask questions during the presentation. So in the GoToWebinar tool, you will see a drop down for questions. You can ask them at any time. And then after the presentation, we'll take some time out to answer your questions. So next, let me introduce our speaker for today, Terry Lynn Davis. And she is a credentialing expert in payor enrollment, as well as primary source verification. She's currently the credentialing director for First Credentialing. She provides nationwide services for a variety of healthcare providers in numerous specialties. With over 15 years of experience in credentialing, she knows how to take complex and difficult tasks and make it as smooth and seamless as possible for her clients. She's never satisfied with the status quo, but instead reaches for higher levels of excellence by simplifying processes, improving standards, and providing educational opportunities such as this one whenever possible. Customer service is Terry Lynn's top priority, and her proactive experiences resonate with her clients. She shares her knowledge and experience through a variety of webinars and conference presentations. Participants in her classes benefit from her credentialing tips and help drive improved payor enrollment outcomes. Terry Lynn holds a Bachelor of Science in Healthcare Administration with a minor in Business Management from Western Kentucky University. And without further ado, I will turn it over to Terry Lynn.
Hello, everyone. So today we're going to talk about delegated credentialing with the managed care plans. We're going to walk through some of the benefits, some of the challenges, and then just your basic how to get started process. And then we'll, like Matt said, take questions along the way and have some Q&A at the end. So please feel free to contribute and ask anything you think of, no matter how big or small it may be. So we're going to start with the definition of delegated credentialing if you've never heard of it. So delegated credentialing occurs when a healthcare entity gives another healthcare entity the authority to credential its practitioners. Insurance payers delegate the primary source verification process to a provider or hospital group in exchange for expediting the credentialing and enrollment time frames. So what this means is the group will actually perform all of the primary source verifications, collect the documents, prepare the file, take it through their own committee, and then the payer agrees to accept that as a credentialed provider and then put them in network. So let's start with the benefits. When you think about timelines, a direct credentialing, so not delegated, but just a direct payor enrollment with the payer is going to be about 90 to 120 days. Now, with that, you have to keep in mind that that process starts from the time they receive all of your documents. They've got to have every item in place. They can come back and ask for additional information, and anything that is missing can cause a delay and extend that timeline. Another challenge is, another benefit is that they delay the process because they're asking for more information. So the benefit side of that is when you're delegating the credentialing, you're controlling the process. So you're collecting that information, you're putting it together, you know what your timelines are, you know what you're dealing with, you know what you're working with. And if you hit a roadblock, you're prepared for that and you're not waiting for the payer to come ask you for additional information. Also, the payers can get backlogged. So when that happens, it's going to delay the process. It's been a huge factor lately. Aetna used to be 90 to 120 days, no problem. And right now we're seeing them process at about 180-day time frame. So all of that is all problems that come from the direct enrollment. And the benefit is that the delegated process is more of about 30 days. And that's for them to load the information. But keep in mind, you've already determined that effective date. And so you know day one when you can start billing. So once you have that file approved, you take that file through committee, you issue that effective date, you send it to the payer. It'll take them about 30 days to load it. But again, you've got that date set in stone and you know what you're working with. The second benefit is going to be faster reimbursement. So you're not waiting on the payer, you're controlling the process, and you know when a provider is going to be effective. This is going to allow you to schedule patients without the fear of an out-of-network payment. So even if a provider is credentialed and just needs to be linked to the group, if you're going direct, that can take 30 to 60 days, and you don't know if you're going to have delayed reimbursement. So they may retro date that day, but it could still be 60 days before you see payment. When you've got delegated credentialing and you're loading them, you're going to get that payment much faster.
Yeah, and I'll add here, Terry Lynn, this is a big problem from a revenue cycle standpoint, and the average physician group loses about $50,000 a month for each month that a provider is not credentialed. And so it's a big loss of dollars that occurs while you're waiting to be able to bill and collect in-network rates for that provider. And so delegated credentialing can really help in that regard.
Yep, those 90 to 120 days definitely add up quickly on the revenue side if you're waiting on that payer to process. And again, you're going to see delays. Every now and then you'll have one that goes through smoothly, but the more providers you're onboarding, the more likely is that you're going to see a delay somewhere along the way. And the third benefit is your providers and your patients both are going to have more satisfaction. So the patients aren't going to see those out-of-network charges coming across on their bill and have to call the office and work through that. The providers are going to be able to see patients day one. You're going to know exactly when that effective date is. I know I've said that a few times, but it's just so critical to the process. It's the number one question I get: when can my provider start seeing patients? So if we don't know because it's in the payer hands, we can't answer that question. When on the delegated side, we can tell you, hey, this is the date it should be approved. And we'll talk a little bit later about how you can control some of that with your providers. So your providers are also going to be happy because they're not going to have that loss of revenue, which can be a big factor on the front end, especially if you're starting a new practice. And then also you're tracking the re-credentialing cycles. And why that is important is because a lot of times those notices from the payers, they either don't show up, they go to the wrong address, or they just don't get sent out. Maybe they said they sent them out, but they didn't go out. And then you don't even know that your providers are about to fall out of network until you get that denied claim. So controlling that re-credentialing process internally allows you to know exactly that the file has been processed, that date has been renewed, and that your provider did not and is not going to fall out of network. And if there's any roadblocks along the way, you can immediately stop seeing patients. Let's say something happens and your provider falls out of compliance, you know immediately, and you can take that provider off the schedule until those issues are rectified. A lot of times with the payers, we don't find out that something's happened until we get that first denial. And then, it could be a week or so before you even know why it denied. And then you're making all these phone calls and doing all of this research, which has taken time and resources from your practice.
Yeah, and from a provider satisfaction standpoint, sometimes when a new provider joins a practice, they're tied to some performance measures that dictate their income. And we find that providers in a delegated credentialing environment are much more satisfied, and they're able to build their practice much quicker than providers that use a traditional enrollment.
Yep, those traditional enrollments for a brand new practice are somewhat challenging, especially if you don't know when those contracts are going to come through, or if they're going to come through. There's also that closed panels are a very real thing right now. So if you're contracted and delegated with a payer, you don't have to worry about that. Your providers are going to get through without any problems. So those were the benefits of the delegated credentialing versus the direct enrollment. So now we're going to talk about some of the challenges that come along with delegated. And while there are challenges, they're all things that can be overcome. These are just important things to keep in mind as you make the determination if this is the best fit for your group or not. So the number one issue is tracking with accuracy. You've got to ensure that there are processes in place to track everything accurately and timely. Missing a date, missing a verification can definitely impact you on the back end. You want to ensure that you have checks and balances so nothing is missed. So don't just have one process in place. Make sure there's multiple processes that can catch things that may be missed along the way so that you can ensure everything is perfect and in line. Keep in mind, these payers are really dependent on you to make sure that your files are complete, they're accurate, they're ready to go. Software and automation are really great resources to ensure accuracy. A lot of groups that start out think, I can do this by spreadsheet, I can do it manually, one person can handle it. Depending on the size of your group, and we'll talk about size later, these are typically larger groups, and doing that on a spreadsheet, one person manually, there's just so much room for error. So using software, using as much automation as you can to get through that is definitely going to help you overcome that challenge to track everything with accuracy. The next thing is making sure you have experienced staff. Again, someone in the organization is just selected and say, hey, you're going to oversee the delegated process. And if that person is not experienced, you're going to have some challenges. So you need someone that knows the process. They need to know what to watch for so that audits can be clean. They need to know your internal guidelines. So everything that you set up in your policies and procedures, which we're going to talk about in a little while, they need to know those inside and out, as well as industry standards. Keep in mind that those industry standards can change over time. So you want somebody that is in the know, that's keeping up with those changes, and then that makes sure your policy is keeping up with the changing times. And then when you select somebody that does have that lack of experience, you risk failing an audit, losing a provider, getting the provider termed because something small was missed. These things, while they're little, can have a very large impact on the revenue and the success of your delegated credentialing. The third challenge is the front-end research and setup. And this is probably the most asked question I get, what are we looking at? It is very time-consuming on the front end, but if done correctly, and if you take that time and you invest that time, it really is an investment. So if you're investing that time, doing your research, getting all of that information collected, it can really benefit your practice if delegated credentialing really truly is a good decision for you. And so part of that front-end research is going to be contacting all the payers. You're going to ask them, what is your minimal requirements? How many providers do I have to have? What standards do you follow? What do you require me to do? Most of them will give you all of that information. It usually comes in a packet. They've got prepared packets that they send out. You will get a direct rep to work with, and so establish that relationship on the front end so that you can go to that person with any questions that you have. We have one right now that we're working with, and they actually let us send over the policies and procedures ahead of time and reviewed them, came back, told us what changes we need to make. So having that relationship and building that relationship is going to be helpful long-term, because you're also going to be able to go back to them as changes come, as something comes up in the process. You need that person to go to. They are also going to do a pre-review of your policies and procedures and your files. So You want to make sure that you don't get too far into the process and then realize something's missing. So again, that open communication, I can't say it enough. You don't want to process 100 files to find out there's this one piece of information that you now have to go back, get recollected on everyone, and send everybody back through committee. So that front end research collection, a true understanding of what is needed is just absolutely critical and vital. Again, time consuming, yes, but worth it in the long run. And then you need to have a process in place before you can even sign agreements. So you have to make sure the standards are being met. You've got to make sure that you can show your capability as a group to handle the delegated process, and you should determine if you may want to go after accreditation. So that is not a requirement to be in a delegated group. I know sometimes there's that misconception that you have to be accredited. You do not have to be. However, sometimes it's beneficial because it really helps with your audit process. They tend to be a little more lenient on organizations that are accredited because you've already gone through that very strict review with that accreditor, and they know that, so they know that those files are probably good to go. And then keep in mind, again, that before you can sign agreements, all of these things have to be done. So you need to get everything in place. You need to collect all of your information. You actually are going to go ahead and process all of your files before they ever do the very first audit. And then reporting is the fourth challenge. And why that is a challenge is because it is not concise. It is not the same report that goes to every payer. They may ask for it in a different format. Most of the time it's going to be a spreadsheet format, but their columns could be different. The information they want reported could be different. So again, on that front end, ask those questions. What do you need from me? What does my report need to look like? Most of them have a template that they'll send over. Again, we talked about it earlier. That's where that software and automation, a software that can run those reports in the format that you need and at least allow you to extract that information, is definitely going to be helpful in overcoming those challenges. So again, all of these challenges can be easily overcome with a good process. Also consider outsourcing or a software to make that process smoother. We'll talk more about that later, but it definitely is helpful and something to consider as part of your decision-making process. Oops, sorry about that. So we've talked about the benefits, we've talked about the challenges, and now what everyone wants to know is, how do I get started? We've touched on a few pieces of it, but I'll actually walk you through each of the things that you need to consider and look at. So the first thing you're going to do is implement a credentialing process. Again, before you can sign an agreement for delegation, that health plan will perform an evaluation of all of your processes. And the things that you will need to establish ahead of that are going to be your policies and procedures. So think about, what will your policy be? And when I say that, I mean, how far back are you going to require work history? Are you going to go 10 years? Are you going to go back all the way to education? Some of this will be determined by the payer and their standards. And some of it will be left up to you. So you really have to look at everything as a whole and decide what you as an organization want to review and decide, this is what our minimum requirements are for our provider to be credentialed and approved. Another thing is COI. So are you going to go back 5 years, 10 years? Keep in mind, you're going to have to track that information down, but don't let that be your deciding factor that you only want to do 2 years because it's such a difficult item to track down. You really want to make sure that you have that history and that you're meeting those standards that are laid out by both the industry and the payer specifically. And then you want to look at, are your policies in line with the standards of each of the payers? Again, we talked about it earlier, collect all of those standards during your research phase. So as well as the minimum provider requirements, ask them what their standards are. They will send them to you in writing. And then what you do is you take all of those policies and you put them all into one and create your own policy. So that's what you're doing. You're making sure that you meet all of the policies and procedures that are across the board. So you only have one set, and that every file you process can go to any of the payers that you work with. The good thing is, a lot of them follow very, very similar standards. Every now and then we'll come across a payer that just has something kind of off the wall that they require just as their own internal process. One that I can think of is Humana. Military gives you the option to run your own background checks, or they'll do them for you. So you just kind of have to look at all of those and decide what you need to include just to ensure everything's covered. The next thing is going to be your application. So you're going to construct an application yourself. A lot of people go with those standard state applications as kind of a base of where to start and then add or delete items you may need. The big thing is whatever is in your policies and procedures, you have got to make sure that's collected on that application document. So if your policies say we're going to collect 10 years of work history, your application needs to collect 10 years of work history. If they say you're going to go back 10 years on malpractice, then you want to make sure that that application collects that information. The other thing I highly advise is asking for as much contact information as possible. Phone number, fax number, email. Your group is going to be the one out doing those verifications, and you probably don't have a database built. You know, some of these payers have been doing this for years, so they know who to go to at the hospitals, at the education facilities. They know where to get that information. You're building that from scratch. It's something you can build up over time. But if you don't know that information, asking the providers for that contact information is very, very, very helpful. A lot of times the providers know a direct person that you can go to, and they'll say, hey, here's, you know, John Doe's email, and he can get you that verification. And that's going to expedite that front end process. So because you're controlling the process, you want to get that done as quickly as possible. That's your ultimate goal, is to get your provider and network as quick as you can, as efficiently as you can. And collecting all of that information on the front end. I get applications all the time, no phone, no fax, no contact. And it's very, very time consuming to go do that research and find that information. So use your providers, use their knowledge, use their contacts, and ask for all of that on the application. And then you're going to have two different kinds of applications. You're going to have your initial appointment application. So that's the first time you ever credential a provider, A to Z, education, work history, all of their documentation, all of their license, any disclosure questions that you need to include. It's going to be a very intense packet, but it's going to collect everything on the front end. And then the second packet is going to be your reappointment packet. So every 2 to 3 years, again, it'll be outlined in your standards, you're going to reprocess the file. So you're going to go through, you're going to re-verify those things that expire. So keep in mind, education doesn't change. From initial appointment to reappointment, their medical school didn't change, their internship didn't change. That doesn't have to be re-verified because it's not something that updates, but a license, a certificate of insurance, work history, malpractice, all of those things can change between credentialing cycles. So that's all stuff that you have to re-verify. So those are the two big things on the applications and the two different processes that you want to make sure that you have covered. The next one is going to be putting together a committee. So you've put this packet together, you've collected all the information, you've gone out and done your verifications. The next thing is a committee has to review that file and say, yes, this provider meets our standards, or no, they don't meet our standards. So you have to keep in mind that some of the payers actually tell you what kind of people you need on your committee. And when I say that, they're looking for providers with similar experience. So let's say you have some MDs, some PAs, some mid-levels, maybe you have some social workers. They want a provider to represent each of those divisions to speak on clinical experience. So to know if something comes up or if there's any questions, to kind of be their content expert on those different clinical divisions.
Terry Lynn, do they also want different specialties to be represented appropriately if it's a multi-specialty group?
Yes, some of them do. So again, any time you have a large variety, and it's going to depend on the makeup of your practice. If there's similar specialties, then not so much. But if you have something, let's say you have a pediatric provider and then you have an orthopedic surgeon. That orthopedic surgeon probably can't speak to everything that a pediatrician may or may not have done or seen, and vice versa. So a good representation, it's not required. It just shows that you're really taking it serious and that you're making sure those clinical questions are being addressed by the committee, and actually reviewed, discussed, talked about. And not every file is going to need that, but there will be from time to time something that comes up due to clinical experience or something that happened, and having a committee that can review that, so that you don't have to immediately say no to somebody just because there may have been a small mishap along the way. Really being able to evaluate that thoroughly is very, very important. Did I answer your question?
Yes, you did. Thank you.
You should also include high-level officials, so maybe a CEO, a COO, somebody that can kind of come from the business side of it. So not just your clinical experience, but also your administrative experience. The other thing is typically an odd number, and some people don't think about that, but you don't want to have a tie break that you can't break. If you stall out because it's a 3-3 vote, you're going to be there all night. So you definitely want to have that kind of tiebreaker. You can determine who that's going to be. Some people say it's their compliance officer. Some people say it's their CEO. And sometimes it doesn't matter. You can just take a majority vote and go with that one. So that's all, again, something that you'll determine in those policies. Those policies and procedures are really going to be your handbook to everything that you do when you're processing these files and going through it. The other thing to keep in mind is that committee is going to need to meet on a regular scheduled basis. It's usually monthly or bi-monthly. And the reason I say that is because a lot of times groups are like, oh, we'll just meet whenever we need to meet. You know, we've got some files, let's get together and approve it. I would really save those ad hoc committees for an emergency situation. It's very difficult to collect a committee. And the larger your committee gets, the harder that's going to be to get everybody together on the spot. They really don't want you just passing the file around and saying, hey, review it. Coming together and discussing that, having an actual meeting. You've got to document that meeting. So part of your audit process is going to be including those committee notes inside of that audit so that they can see that you truly are meeting. You're reviewing those files. There's open discussion, and that it's not just one person making that decision and everybody else signing off on it. It's the integrity of the file, and that's what you want to show. You want to show that you're really putting that effort in. Again, these payers are entrusting you to handle that process, so you really want to take it seriously and show them that that's what you're doing for them. And then the last thing that committee is going to do once they've had the meeting, everybody signed off on it. It's really good to put together an approval sheet that each person on the committee can sign so that it's documented. And then an actual approval letter is going to go into the file, and we'll talk about maintaining the files later and that being part of that file.
The thing I like about this in terms of delegated credentialing is that internally as an organization, you control when the committee meets, and rather than waiting on a health plan that may meet quarterly, or all the files may not be in time to meet this month's credentialing committee, you control it as an organization. And so that's a big part of how it drives a faster credentialing. And let's say you've got a provider that is in a specialty that's really important for a community. And you can have an ad hoc emergency meeting to credential somebody, just a matter of moving at your own pace rather than the pace of the health plan.
Yep, absolutely. Good input there. So the next step is going to be those executing those delegated agreements. So I really want to stress it here that the delegated agreements and your contracts or agreements with the payer are two separate things. You have your delegated agreement that says, hey, the payer agrees that this group is going to do their own delegated credentialing, and the group agrees to all of the requirements. And then you also have your contract, which outlines your fee schedule and those types of things. So those are two separate contracts. You have to get both of those in place. So that's a really important step, and a step that some people don't think about. They get all the delegated credentialing in place, they get the delegated agreement in place, and then the payer has no contract to pay you off of. It's something you definitely want to do simultaneously, if not already in place if you already have a contract in place with the payer for that payment, then you're good to go. So that doesn't have any impact on your delegated agreement, again, because it's two separate processes, two separate departments. All of that just needs to be, you need to make sure you do both. The contracts, and when I'm talking about contracts in this next slide, I'm talking about delegated agreements. So we've talked about the payer contract and what they're going to pay you off of. So put that to the side and forget about that for now. This is strictly about the delegated agreements. And so those are going to cover the responsibility of each party. They're going to say the group is responsible for processing files. They're responsible for reporting this frequently. It's really going to outline step by step what the responsibility of the group is. And on the other side of that, it also outlines what the health plan is responsible for. So it says, you know, they agree to accept your committee approval. They agree to load everything in a certain amount of time, and really, again, just outlining those responsibilities so that everybody knows who's responsible for what. Again, we talked about earlier, Humana and the background checks. So there's actually a spot on their contract that says, you know, we'll take care of that if you want us to at no additional fee. So reading those fine prints and knowing what they may be willing to do is definitely helpful so that you understand the full scope. Again, each of those agreements are going to be unique to each payer. So reviewing and knowing what each payer covers and then what you're responsible for is definitely vital and critical to the process. It's also going to, inside of that agreement, list the reporting frequency and the method of submission. We touched on this earlier. Those are usually monthly reports for the payer. You're going to include any updates, changes, additions, certain negative action items. So let's say something comes up and there's a problem with one of your providers. I would not wait until that next cycle, that next monthly cycle, to notify the payer. I would reach out to your rep the moment that you know and say, this is what's going on, what do I need to do? If it's something that provider needs to stop seeing those patients, you know right away and can take care of that. Again, you don't want to lose revenue. You don't want them to come back and recoup because your provider fell out of compliance along the way and you didn't make the proper notification. That responsibility is on you to track that and to notify the payer of those things. So just keeping up with those and being aware of what's going on. Those payer reps we've talked about time and time again are just really, really vital to that part of the process because they can help guide you through those steps to ensure you're doing everything that you need to do and not just out there kind of suffering in silence until the time comes. And then again, typically spreadsheet format, having a software that can run that for you is definitely beneficial so that you can ensure that you do those not only accurately, but efficiently and timely. You know when they're going to come around. You may be running verifications on Thursday and that report may be due on Friday. So you don't want to get stuck in the staying up all night or staying at the office all night trying to update a report that has to be to them by the next morning. So again, accuracy, efficiency, definitely part of that and is going to be outlined in those agreements. The next one is one that people often don't think about, but in a performance evaluation process. And what I mean by that is if something does come up, if a complaint is made to the compliance officer, this is where that compliance officer is really beneficial. Being able to track those complaints, those anything that comes up that you need to document, you need to have a process in place to document it, evaluate it. It may be that you need to have an ad hoc committee meeting to evaluate that process. Again, having that plan in place so that you're not, kind of scurrying and trying to get all of that together when it happens, just really being prepared. Those compliance officers know those things. They know what they're looking for. They're probably already collecting that data and maintaining that in some form or fashion. So incorporating that into that process is really important. And it's going to be required as part of that agreement.
Yeah, and there's a question here about that I'll go ahead and address about whether this delegated credentialing can put your group at risk. And my comment would be no more risk than what you would have otherwise if you did not have delegated credentialing. But what it can do is put a group in a position where they have to develop their compliance officer and enforce rules and potentially terminate a provider because of their performance. And that's not normally something you see traditionally, but instead of creating more risk externally, I would say it can create risk internally with the organization.
Yeah, and I think also the risk is if you're letting the payer run those verifications, and we talked about it earlier, the risk is you don't find out on the front end. If you're internally monitoring those, you know pretty immediately what's going on, and can be prepared for that. So if you need to pull a provider off the schedule until something's figured out, there's that less financial risk, and I think that's something to take into account.
Yeah, and Terry Lynn, the question that was presented goes on to talk about if a license was not renewed properly or there was a malpractice incident. That's something through the primary source verification that needs to be tracked. Is that correct?
Correct. And I see the question now. So let's say, and I actually talk about this later, but we'll go and talk about it now. Let's say a provider doesn't renew, so their license expires. You're running those verifications constantly. So if you know the license expires, let's say on 3/1, on 2/29, if that provider hasn't renewed it, you pull them off the schedule. You don't let them see patients after 3/1 until you can verify that license in place. Again, a lot of times, if you're relying on the payer to run those verifications, you may not be paying attention to that. So you may not find out till after the fact, hey, it's not, maybe they did renew it and it's just not showing on the website. Those kinds of things happen. So again, that internal process is keeping you in control. It's keeping you in the know. You're going to be much more informed about your providers and what's going on than you ever have been before, because that's something that, the payer's relying on you to do, but you do have so much control over it. But the knowledge that comes from that and the documentation that you're going to maintain is really going to be beneficial to you in the long run. Is that good? And I also see at the end of the question, is it at risk for losing delegated credentialing as a whole? So as long as you're reporting those findings, you're reporting that a provider didn't renew a license, you've pulled them off the schedule, that needs to be part of your process we talked about a while ago. So if a provider's license expires, we pull them off the schedule. It's as simple as that. So they're not seeing patients. And when the provider or when the payer comes back and does an audit, if they say, hey, this provider's license was expired from 3/1 to 3/5, you say it's okay because they didn't see any patients. And you can document they didn't see any patients. That provider's probably not even going to fall out of network. You have put a plan in place. You have followed it. You have made sure there's a resolution. So all of your bases are covered. But no, it's not going to put the only thing that puts the whole group at risk of losing delegation is not reporting. So it's not what each individual provider does, is you as a group not reporting something that needs to be reported. All right, that was a really good question. I think we covered all the parts. If not, please feel free to let us know if you have any additional questions or need any more clarification on that. We left off at the performance evaluation process. Now we're going to talk about, and we kind of touched on it just now, so how are you going to rectify those non-compliance issues? You found a file was non-compliant during an audit. You need to have that process in place to say, this is what we're going to do going forward. If you get what we call a ding on an audit, so if they come back and find something was wrong, having a corrective action plan in place to say, okay, this is what we're going to do going forward. So let's say you missed a OIG verification because somebody didn't save it into the correct file, or they saved over another file. You need to make part of your process. You need to have those checks and balances. Way back at the beginning of the presentation, we talked about checks and balances. This is why they're so critical. You don't just want one person in charge of looking at a file. You need multiple eyes on it. You need multiple processes in place because you want to make sure that every T is crossed, every I is dotted, that everything has been checked and double checked and verified, just to ensure that that file is 100% in compliance. And then keep in mind, ultimately, the health plan has final say on providers that will be part of your agreement. Very, very rarely do they come back and challenge a decision of a group, but you do have to keep in mind, for any reason, they do have the final say. So technically, they are their providers in their network, and they can say, nope, we don't want them, or no, we're not taking any more. I have not seen it happen. I just want everybody to be aware that they do have final say, and that's definitely going to be part of that agreement. All right. The next is going to be, and this is our last part of this topic on how to get started, is maintaining the files. So the things that you want to do is monitor that sanction activity, and that's the, if you've not heard of it, or maybe you have, it's the OIG, the SAMs, the Medicare opt-out. All of these websites that track sanctions on providers need to be checked monthly. You definitely want to keep any documentation of those you run. If you're running them manually, just screenshotting or printing. This is the important thing. You print the search field that shows the name and the social that you searched, but also the results. So just a good documentation process is definitely needed. You want to maintain those rosters. So I advise that you, again, if you're using a software and an automation process, it's always going to be pulling the most current information. This is where tracking those things manually becomes very cumbersome, because every time an expiration date changes, every time something updates, you have to go in and update that spreadsheet. If you've got 5 payers that want 5 different spreadsheets, that's 5 different times you've got to go and track it. So I just cannot stress enough how much the automation of those reports is critical in saving your practice time and resources and getting that done. The things they're going to be looking for are initial approvals, so those files that were initially approved the first time and those dates that they were approved. Any re-credentialing approvals, including updated information. So if information changed from cycle to cycle, you want to include that in the update. And then any demographic changes along the way. So let's say a provider's name changes or a license expires. Those can be in those monthly updates. So if it's 3/1 and I'm not sending another roster until 4/1, as long as I document and I have verification that we verified that on time, it can go on those monthly reports. So it may be a month after it expires and it's been renewed, but that's okay, because you're updating them and you've got that verification on file that says we verified this in a timely manner. And then the last thing is going to be your electronic files. So you want to maintain a copy of everything. And when I say everything, I mean everything. The original application signed by the provider, you can determine if you're going to accept electronic signatures or if you want wet signatures, and if you're going to scan those in or have them scanned to you. All of that's fine, but you do want that original application without any markups by your group. Don't change information. Don't say, oh, what's that date, and let me change it for you. Really make sure those providers are providing that information to you. You want all the original documents that were submitted by the provider, as well as all verifications that you run during the process. Any letters that you send out and receive back, any online verifications that you do, anything that you can show where you verified each piece of information as required, and you want to keep that as part of your electronic file. And those include the verifications done between cycles. So a lot of people think, okay, I will track these verifications during initial and re-credentialing, but even ongoing, every time that license up for expiration, you've got to make sure you pull that updated certificate and there's no lapse between the expiration date and the next issue date. That's really important to watch for. And again, if something happened and there was a 4-day delay, making sure that that provider has not seen patients and that you've pulled them off the schedule. You want to include those committee approval letters we talked about, and then any committee meeting notes, keep them all electronically. If you'll keep all of this information electronically in a file, when it comes time for audit, you're not scrounging around, you're not digging through files looking for missed verifications. Everything's nice, neat, and pretty and ready to go. Most of these audits are done electronically now, and they say, email me 10 files, and you just email them. So it's already right there, and you just shoot that file over or drop it into a SharePoint, whatever the payer's willing to accept, and everything's right there. It's in order. It's ready to go. And you don't have to, again, digging for a verification from a year and a half ago that where you verified a license is not something you want to do the day before an audit. You definitely want to be prepared for those and just have everything in a nice, neat electronic file. And that's all I have. I hope it was helpful. It's a lot of information. I tried not to talk too fast, but I definitely wanted to ensure we got all of the information into our time slot, because it really is a critical part of the process. And I know a lot of people are probably just trying to decide, do I want to do this? So I hope that was information that was helpful in making that decision.
Thank you, Terry Lynn. And we've got some time for questions. And so I'm going to jump into the questions. But before I do that, I just want to remind everyone that you can ask questions on the GoToWebinar question box. Feel free to keep them coming as you hear a question. Sometimes it reminds you of another question that you would like to ask. And so I'll just jump into some of the questions we're seeing. Terry Lynn, when should an organization start the data collection process for a new provider?
We get that a lot. So ASAP, and I can't say that enough. Something you can do and something you might want to consider, make the date of hire contingent upon passing the credentialing process. So this means that provider has to provide all of their information to you. They have to pass the process. Then you know that date of hire, they can start seeing patients. Also, it gives them a little bit of push to provide you information. I know providers are busy. I know that credentialing and primary source is not always the top of their list, but it is so vital to your revenue that it's important that you do whatever you can to help drive that process forward. And if it's, hey, your start date is the date you pass committee, they're going to be very, very helpful, especially when you have providers that are eager to get into practice and, eager to get started. They're going to do everything they can to help you get all of that information collected and verified as quickly as possible.
Okay. The next question here is, how difficult is it to bring an experienced credentialer who's used to doing typical credentialing up to speed and be effective at delegated credentialing?
So it depends on what you mean by a credentialer. There are two different types of credentialing. Of course, I'm sure everybody knows. You have your payor credentialing and then your primary source credentialing. Very rarely do we come across people in the industry that know both sides. So there's going to be a learning curve. You've got to decide if that person, you really want to go with somebody that knows that primary source, that knows the privileging side of it. Not all payor enrollment experts do, because a payor enrollment expert is collecting the information and sending it off to the payor. So they know what to collect. They know what's needed. They may not know how to verify it, where to verify it, what is involved in that verification. So that's where that expert on the delegated side really is important and useful and helpful. It's going to depend on the person if they can pick up both sides of it. But we laugh all the time because somebody is normally a payor person or a primary source person. Very rarely do you find one that likes both of them. So you definitely want somebody that likes what they're doing and is going to be engaged. So just keep all of that in mind.
Okay, and closely related to that, there's a question, do some organizations utilize vendors to keep track of policies, procedures, data, and reporting?
They do, because it is such a, we've talked about, and we've really talked about the basics here. We haven't gotten in depth in the verification. So having that expert person, again, is sometimes difficult to find. And depending on the size of your organization, a lot of the vendors that are experienced that you can outsource to are really just staffed and have the ability to do those verifications and those process files in large quantities. You're not typically talking about 5 to 10 files. You're usually 100+ providers, so that can become very cumbersome very fast. If you don't have a software that you use, if you don't have an automated process. Those vendors almost always do. We do. We do both payor enrollment and primary source. And so for those clients that need that help with delegated credentialing, we do everything from helping them develop the policies and procedures, collecting the information, building those applications, building those files, and actually processing the files. We have a software that helps us. We have experts that are very well versed and very well trained on industry standards, and really have that knowledge that you need and that you're looking for and that you may not have internally to do.
Okay. Here's the next question. Do you have any suggestions for starting points for policies and procedures that relate to compliance, process, action plan? And yeah, I think that's the gist of it, you know, kind of a boilerplate starting point for delegated credentialing policies.
We have a template that we use that we've developed over time. And what we've done is, again, we've looked at several payors, we've pulled out the things that are common, and then those one-offs that are for each of the payors, and really encompass that into one. So if you're starting from scratch, you don't have anything, again, I can't stress that front-end research, use those payors. They actually send you basically step-by-step what they want in your policies and procedures, and you fine-tune it to make it relevant to your group, maybe stick your group name in. The hardest part is combining all of them into one. And again, those are where those experts come into place. You don't want to be repetitive. You don't want to get so involved in the details. While you need to be detailed, you don't want to start duplicating your information, because that just makes that audit process even more difficult. You've got to keep in mind these payors are going to be reading through those policies and procedures, so they need to be very flowing and easy to, you know, understand and relate to, so that they can ensure that they're matching. They take it and actually match policy to policy, standard to standard. So being very streamlined in that is very critical and important.
Okay. And what software would you recommend to use for tracking and reporting?
So there are several out there. Of course, I'm very partial to our own because it's the one I know, the one I know and use. We use one called FirstCred that we have actually developed internally. And the benefit to that is we have built it as a credentialing software. It's not a billing software that does credentialing. It's not a practice management software that does credentialing. It is a credentialing software that does credentialing. We have two divisions. We've got the payor enrollment division and the primary source division. And each of those portals is very, very customized to what's being asked for, what's being collected. Basically the application is put into the system, and then we can run reports however we need to. It's the best thing that we've done in that automation process. It's automating those reports. So it doesn't matter what a payor asks us for. We can run it on the spot. We're not spending several hours putting a report together. We say, this is what we need, type it in about 5 minutes, we can pull it out and have it ready to go.
Okay. If an organization opts to use an outsourced vendor, does the choice of vendor ever play into the speed or likelihood of being accepted into a delegated credentialing arrangement?
They do ask that you disclose which vendor you're using. It doesn't necessarily, I don't want to say it speeds things up or changes anything, because they're really looking at the process. The advantage of using that outsourced vendor is that you've got the experts. You've got people that have already done this. They know what those payors are looking for. They've already probably established relationships with these payors. And again, that relationship, like the Humana, I know I keep going back to that one. That's just the most recent one I've worked with, the Humana military rep. I can go to her with questions because she and I have built that relationship. I can pick up the phone. She knows my number when it comes across. So that's an advantage. I've already built that relationship and we have that. So I think that's where you might see an increase in speed. Again, you're controlling the process, so that speed is really with you and your process.
Okay. Is there a limit to the number of providers that an insurance company will require for delegated credentialing?
So again, probably one of the top questions we get. Most are going to say 100 plus providers. There's no cap out. I've never seen them cap it out at a certain number. There's usually a minimum number. However, I don't want that 100 number to deter you. Some may require 500. There are a couple out there I have seen that say you really need to have 500 providers. That may or may not be every payer. It's not typically 100 is normally the standard, but don't be deterred by that 100 number. I have a group right now that has 50 providers, but what they did is they put together a growth plan. They are a mental health telehealth provider. So their services are in high demand, and they were able to show their projected growth over the next year and a half. So with, like I said, I think maybe 40 to 50 providers is what they're up to right now. Their top payer has agreed to enter into delegated agreement with them, which is very advantageous for them. So they didn't take, that 100 minimum as an answer. Be prepared. Really sell yourself and what you have to offer as a group, especially if it's a payer that is a high volume for you and maybe an advantage for you.
Okay, here's a question about organizations that practice, that have patients across state lines. It's very common for towns or groups that are near borders of states. Is the delegated credentialing per payer per state, or is it per payer?
It depends. So Humana Military is one that's by region. So there's the East region and a West region. We have discovered they will take one delegated agreement, but you do have to hold contracts in both regions. So those payer contracts have to be in both regions. And then there are other payers like the Blues come to mind for me, all the Blue Cross Blue Shield, because they are different contractors. A lot of the times they have different requirements. So you do have to go to each of those. I have a large group right now that we're working with, and I think they're in 4 or 5 different states. And we actually, during our research phase, had to go to each state. Some states they qualified and some they didn't. You've got to keep in mind too, are your providers are they specific to one state, or are they crossing lines? Because that definitely helps in being able to show. And then you have some like your Aetna, who, while you may have different contracts for different states, will take one delegated agreement. So that delegated agreement will cover all of the Aetna contracts. So again, during that research phase, that's a really good question to ask, especially if you're a practice that has kind of those little quirks or very specific scenarios, to make sure that they're covered and that you're doing everything you need to do on the front end to ensure payment. You don't want to assume just because you're delegated with Aetna and you have a contract in Kentucky that in Ohio you're good to go, because that may not be the case.
Okay, and we've got 2 minutes left here, so I'll try to ask a quick question if that's possible. So if you have delegated credentialing with some payers and your traditional credentialing through others, how do you keep track of them separately?
Yes, so this is definitely 100% going to be every practice. There is not a practice out there that has everything delegated, because you've got to keep in mind the government plans don't offer delegation. Your Medicare and Medicaid are not something that will delegate credentialing. That's always going to be direct. And all of your commercial payers are not set up for delegation. So some of them don't even have the resources to offer that to you. So you really need to have 2 separate processes in place, your direct payer enrollment process in place, and then your delegated process in place, and making sure that while they work side by side, that they can definitely be maintained efficiently. Again, having 2 different departments that handle that's how we run things. I have a payer enrollment department and a primary source department, just because I have material experts in each of those divisions to make sure that you're following the processes, because they're similar processes, but they're also very different processes.
Well, that's all the time we have for today. I want to thank all of you for attending. I want to thank Terry Lynn for giving us this valuable information. We will be sending out this presentation to you so that you can see it, and it will include the slides that Terry Lynn presented Thank you again for your time, and we will adjourn for the day.
Thanks.